Welcome back to our viewers to our conference on climate justice. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Byron Williamston, who is in Canada. He is professor of philosophy at Wilfrid Laurier University and a member of the Interdisciplinary Center on Climate Change at the University of Waterloo. He received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Toronto. I should say Toronto, if I'm to pronounce it correctly, Toronto, and has taught previously at the University of Toronto and the University of South Florida. He has published extensively on the ethics of climate change and the Anthropocene, the philosophy of history, the philosophy of technology, motivated irrationality, and 17th century philosophy. His most recent book is Philosophy and the Climate Crisis: How the Past Can Save the Present. Please welcome Professor Williston.
Great, thank you for that introduction, and thanks, Professor Mahmoudi, for the invitation to speak here today. I've heard some wonderful papers so far. So I don't have a slideshow for you, but there's nothing terribly technical here, so I hope that's not an issue. My paper is going to explore the connection between national well-being and the relatively new concept of planetary health. Climate change poses clear threats to well-being, which, following the philosopher Derek Parfit, we can define as what makes someone's life go best. But beyond this very abstract definition, well-being is a highly contested concept. Some of the confusion and the contestation springs from the fact that well-being studies has multiple possible objects. So we can talk about individual lives, both whole lives and parts of lives, about child well-being, about medical well-being, and of course about national well-being. These objects can get quite granular or focused, as happens, for instance, when we talk about well-being for migrants or well-being in the context of unstable employment. Part of the task, therefore, is to clarify what kind of well-being we're focusing on, what the object of our analysis is. Here, I'm going to talk about national well-being in the age of climate crisis. Why do we need this sort of analysis? Well, in the first place, to push back against the still dominant measure of national well-being, which is per capita GDP, because it both counts too many of the wrong things and leaves out of account too many of the genuinely valuable things in life. This problem has not gone unnoticed. There's a growing chorus of academics and policymakers arguing that per capita GDP is a poor measure of value. That is why so many alternative metrics have been developed, among them the Genuine Progress Indicator, the GPI, the Happy Planet Index, the HPI, the Better Life Index, the BLI, the Social Progress Index, the SPI, Gross National Happiness Index, GNHI, the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and so on. So most of these are notable in correcting for one of the major, they're very different amongst each other, but they're notable for correcting for one of the major perceived failings of GDP, its inability to value biospherical health correctly, and thus to show how national well-being is intrinsically dependent on proper biospherical governance. Because it does this so clearly and explicitly, the most promising construct to have emerged lately is that of planetary health. Rather than tinkering around the edges of the current policy system, planetary health has the potential to guide the truly transformative change we require in the age of climate crisis. So the paper has 4 sections. I'm going to begin with some theoretical spade work, philosophical work, arguing that because it can overcome the pitfalls of its parent theories, subjectivism and objectivism, the most plausible theory of well-being is a hybrid of these 2 parents, right? So some sort of hybrid between subjectivist and objectivist theories. I'll explain what those terms mean when I get to them. So that's the first section. Next, I examine the concept of national well-being, refining it in the way that I suggested above, that is to account for the challenges of adaptation to climate disruption. The third section is about planetary health, the master concept that should guide management of the planetary regime. And finally, I show how all of this is related to justice issues by linking planetary health and traditional ecological knowledge that possessed by the world's indigenous peoples. So first, philosophical theories of well-being. I'm going to begin this section by laying out the main divisions among theories of well-being. The most helpful approach to that is the one suggested again by Parfit, which picks out two broad theory types, subjectivism and objectivism. He actually lists three, but we'll just stick to these two. So first, subjective theories, according to which well-being is a function of an agent's pro-attitudes, usually pleasure or desire satisfaction. The main attraction of subjectivism is that it ties something's being good for you to your positive experience of that thing. Conversely, it ties badness to negative experience. It's a superficially powerful idea, but subjectivism has been subjected to intense criticism over the years. If we take the desire fulfillment version of the theory, for example, the main criticism is that subjectivism fails to account critically for desires that are trivial, self-destructive, or immoral. I might desire to spend my life counting blades of grass or torturing cats, but most of us think that desires like this don't genuinely count towards my well-being. In the first case, because the desire is trivial. And the second, because it is immoral. We fasten on this general point applies. The theory accords too much weight to subjective judgments about well-being. So the second theory type, objectivism, avoids that problem by positing that well-being is a function of some cluster of objective goods being actualized in the life of the agent. So objective list theory brings together a very large collection of kinds, each of which is unique in the list of objective goods it isolates, but the defining feature of all of them is what is called attitude independence. That is, objective list theory gives no fundamental role to people's beliefs about what is good for them. This is where the most important objection to objective list theories enters the picture. This has come to be known as the alienation objection. For example, Aristotelians, who are objectivists, generally claim that political activity, in the context of the polis for Aristotle, but any political collective will do. So political activity is a necessary component of well-being. But we can imagine an apolitical person living a rich life in the absence of this activity. Does her non-participation in an activity she loathes really diminish her well-being? Perhaps not. Now generalize the question to every item on any objective list. It's possible to imagine an agent who genuinely wants nothing to do with any of them, and it's not obvious that this stance will deprive her altogether of well-being, as the theory maintains it will. So the theory potentially alienates agents from what they think makes their lives go better. We are now in a quandary. Problems with subjectivism lead us to an objective list theory, but problems with the latter send us scurrying right back to the former. Because this is a philosophically unsatisfying position to be in, it makes sense to try and combine the two approaches into something like a hybrid theory. According to hybrid theories, the whole structure of subjective and objective features in any life is valuable because of the way its parts interact. The most important aspect of the hybrid theory for my purposes is the way it can illuminate how objective features of well-being, like political affiliation and levels of education, do not so much override subjective features like the sense of life satisfaction or feelings of social trust and political security, but can help tune them in just the right way. It's a bit like Blaise Pascal's argument from the 17th century about how to convert the pleasure-loving libertine from vice to virtue. Have him go through the motions of religious piety so that his desires will eventually become attuned to what is objectively good for him. Aristotle says much the same thing about the ideally virtuous agent who wants to do what is objectively right. So Pascal's convert and Aristotle's virtuous agent both exemplify a hybrid conception of well-being. Agential well-being consists here in the harmony between attitude-dependent life satisfaction and attitude-independent achievement of what is objectively good. Can we say more about this? Well, I don't have time here for too much detail, but consider the work of philosopher and novelist Iris Murdoch. For Murdoch, art, love, and philosophy can free us from the grip of what she calls the fat, relentless ego, because they put us in touch with an order of objective goods, the apprehension of which can then further calm us existentially. So, specific subjective factors of well-being enable access to specific objective factors, which when apprehended or instantiated, further enhance the subjective factors. Now, I see Murdoch's whole body of work, which is really about well-being in a very expansive sense of the term, as a testament to the power of hybridism about well-being. What unites these ways of knowing and being, virtue, love, philosophy, art, is that proper appreciation of what they demand requires hard discipline and often sacrifice. The process of moral education moves from the outside in, from guided encounter with objective goods to the proper training of the will and intellect. If it's to result in the attainment of well-being, the process cannot be held hostage to subjective assessments, especially in its early stages. So this is the model I propose for national well-being in the age of climate crisis. And that brings me to my second section. Because I believe that climate change is altering the political world in a fundamental way, including what it means to be a member of this or that political collective, I propose, as I said just earlier, that national well-being simpliciter must be refined as national well-being in the age of climate crisis, or at least that that's a worthy object of our focus. As a way of measuring how members of nations are faring, national well-being in the age of climate crisis must encompass both subjective and objective features. This makes hybridism the best theoretical underpinning for it. Climatic disturbances will inevitably affect the objective, social, and environmental conditions of human flourishing in a way that is inescapably tied to considerations of national, international, and intergenerational justice. Attending to these considerations in the process of adaptation is one way of being objectivists about well-being. Why not simply trust existing values to do the work of bringing on the required transformation? Key question. Well, we mustn't forget that this crisis is a product of moral and political failure, and that the failure infects our entire understanding of and approach to who we are and how we're meant to live together on this planet. What we think is good for us may not in fact be so in the face of this crisis. Of course, I'm thinking here mostly of the values and desires of the sort of average middle-class citizens whose votes our mainstream political parties all want. If these values and desires are our policy touchstones, the best climate policy we will get will be merely incrementalist and not transformative. The popularity over the past few years of the notion of nudging among some economists, like Cass Sunstein, for example, expresses that idea that successful policy can never challenge fundamentally the existing values and desires of citizens. At most, it can use those values and desires to edge people very slightly along the desired pathway. However, the challenge is that these considerations do not permit us to run entirely roughshod over subjective considerations. That's the challenge of the hybrid approach that I'm suggesting here. We must, to some extent, work through citizens' values, while also being prepared to both override those values where they conflict with the requirements of justice, and work to attune the values to the achievement of objective goods. So, what should such a theoretical construct look like? National well-being in the age of climate crisis, one that's attuned to this hybrid theory I'm suggesting. Well, I suggest that it must be developmental, on analogy with the most plausible conception of child well-being. Anna Alexandrova has constructed a theory of this type. She's a philosopher. So I'll pursue my point with reference to her project. A developmental account makes obvious sense in the case of children. What's good for the infant is obviously different than what's good for the teen. But the stages of childhood are just as obviously linked. And this means ideally that well-being at any single stage must be both good for the child at that stage and good for them insofar as they are on the path to the next stage. That is to say, An adequate understanding of well-being for children must be both present-directed and future-directed. One way to understand this is that the present-directedness is weighted to subjective considerations, while the future-directedness is weighted to objective considerations. We want children to be happy in the present, yes, but also to engage in those activities that best prepare her for the next stage in life. These activities, like eating her broccoli and doing her sums, will not necessarily make her happy in the present. 2 points must be stressed here. First, while rarely altogether irrelevant, the subjective judgment is also never fully authoritative. But second, if all goes well, the relation between the subjective and the objective shifts in favor of the subjective over the course of the developmental trajectory. That's because the child becomes gradually more rationally self-sufficient, and her growing autonomy is reflected in the judgment made by those responsible for her that her practical deliberations ought to become increasingly self-directed. Her view simply counts for more the older she gets. So that's the basic theory of child well-being, just its scaffolding, if you like. What can it tell us about the health of nations? An arresting example of how this basic model can be applied to nations can be found in a recent account of the 200-year development of the Nordic countries, so Finland, Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, from poor, feudally organized social structures to modern nations that regularly now top international lists of the best places on the planet to live. The authors of this study link the developmental trajectories of these countries to Kohlbergian individual developmental stage theory. The Nordic secret, as they call it, is an educational process whose explicit aim is to develop individuals into citizens who care about the collectivities to which they belong. So it begins with the egoistic, isolated individual and ends finally with consideration of the planet and future generations, with a whole bunch of stages in between those two endpoints on the developmental path. Each stage of development expands the circle of trust, the citizen's sense of who or what she has responsibility for. Part of the challenge of talking this way is that it clashes with what we might call the hubris of the present. To speak in openly developmental terms about nations and larger collectives, even of humanity itself, leaves open the possibility that at any point on this path, there's still some growing up to do. This might be true, even though many members of the collective believe they've attained a pinnacle of moral and political maturity. However, though challenging, this is an aspect of the approach that I think should be emphasized. Most adults view themselves, for the most part quite rightly, as being further along than children are in the developmental process. They're thus inclined to resist the suggestion that there's a sense in which they themselves might still be like children. When Immanuel Kant said that although we, that is to say, 18th century Europeans, live in the age of enlightenment, we are not yet enlightened. This is one of my favorite phrases. That's what he was getting at. When Greta Thunberg addresses adult audiences, she has a biting way of challenging their presumed authority as adults. Indeed, she suggests that her generation of climate activists has progressed further along the path of moral development than they have. This is why so many adults, especially men, treat her with such dismissive contempt. I think we need to take Kant and Thunberg to heart here. We need a much keener appreciation of the extent to which we still have a lot of growing up to do as members of national collectives. Because our attempts to deal with climate change have been such an abject failure, we must be open to an unflattering revaluation of our moral maturity. Just above, I express my agreement with the view that as the child ages, the balance between objective and subjective features of well-being shifts in favor of subjective features. But if with respect to the climate crisis, we're more childish than we like to think, it follows that we should adopt a measure of national well-being that is correspondingly less subjectivist and more objectivist than we might otherwise be inclined to accept, were we not, say, in the midst of an existential crisis. So that's what I want to say about national well-being. and linking it to this developmental project on explicit analogy with what I think are the best accounts of child development out there. So next I'll say more about the measure is going to look, what the measure will look like. And there I come to this notion of planetary health. So let's take this idea that we're in a state of relative moral immaturity one step further. We are, I suggest, this is a bit provocative, but I'll say it anyways. We're a bit like a teenager whose moral compass is in serious disrepair because he's hooked on hard drugs. We're now faced with recurrent climatic disturbances that are testing societal resiliency. A recent pessimistic analysis suggests two possible broad outcomes. The first is that we get through the crises via various buffering feedbacks, social buffering feedbacks. So this is the path of high resilience, but it may not be a happy path. According to Haynes and Frumkin, who, by the way, have written now the Bible of planetary health. This just came out in 2021, Planetary Health, Safeguarding Human Health and the Environment in the Anthropocene, sort of the book about the concept now, which I urge you all to have a look at. So according to Haynes and Frumkin, this high resilience pathway can be achieved so long as at least three conditions are in place: an emphasis on cosmic order, a rallying of elites, that is to say no fragmentation of elites or no serious fragmentation of elites, and deep societal transformation. If all goes reasonably well, these conditions can then lead to what they call new ideologies, some of which will be helpful in arresting the process of biospherical breakdown. However, even that high resilience pathway that I just sketched for you is dangerous, since it can just as easily lead to an authoritarian global political regime, or even national political regime. So it's thus disturbing to see Haynes and Frumkin add a fourth condition to the high resilience pathway, which they call the emergence of military leaders. And that could result in a conservative archaizing trend in society. So that's the best possible outcome, according to them, right? That we lurch toward a kind of authoritarianism. The low resilience pathway is even worse. Here, persistent climatic perturbations result in the spread of epidemic diseases, the polarization of elites, urban decline, and political simplification, all of which could lead to the complete fracture of the social order, chaotic internal migration, and ultimately state collapse, and perhaps even warlordism. So this is the picture of our teenage species that I think we need to look unflinchingly at. If we do, we may not be so reluctant to talk in terms of objective conditions for flourishing or well-being. If we get the objective conditions for flourishing right, agents will experience higher levels of subjective satisfaction with their lives. Ultimately, I think it may take some time for that to happen. To be concrete, affordable housing, good jobs, a high degree of social trust, low crime rates, access to quality education, and so on, and stable climatic conditions make lives go better. I think that the evidence for that is very clear. The best measures of well-being developed so far recognize this, at least implicitly. For example, the OECD's Better Life Index, the BLI, I had that whole sort of catalog of measures before, or constructs before. The BLI, in my opinion, at least, is one of the better of them. It lists 11 dimensions of well-being, carefully constructed so as to mix objective features like the ones I just mentioned, right? Good jobs, affordable housing, and so on, with measures of life satisfaction and perceptions of safety and work-life balance, all of which are best construed as subjective dimensions. By contrast, the genuine progress indicator, the GPI, which I think is less good, focuses on various aspects of environmental and economic well-being, but provides no role for subjective value judgments whatsoever. And I think that's a problem. So this is by no means the last word on the comparison between the Better Living Index and the GPI, right? The genuine progress indicator. For one thing, the GPI is much more thorough, in spite of the criticism I just launched at it, which is that it doesn't contain any subjective factors. It's much more thorough regarding the environmental conditions of flourishing, listing specific measures like ozone depletion, CO2 emissions, loss of wetlands and forests, pollution, and so on. So what we evidently require is an umbrella concept, one that not only provides a basis for combining subjective and objective features, but is also appropriately frank about the values that are at stake in engaging in this measurement business in the first place, right? This well-being measurement business in the first place. So the recently developed concept of planetary health, I think, fits the bill, at least potentially. Here's a recent definition of it, and I'm taking this from that Haynes and Frumkin text that I showed you a minute ago. They say this: planetary health focuses on the potential for damage to the planet's natural life support systems to undermine and reverse progress in human health, and emphasizes the importance of solutions that allow human societies to flourish within finite planetary boundaries. I want to emphasize that concept, at much lower levels of environmental change than today's. So, planetary health provides a way of combining the best features of all the other environmentally based frameworks or constructs or measures, the whole dizzyingly confusing catalog that I mentioned before. And this is because it explicitly ties the health and well-being of all humans to the health of the planet. And also that it at least gestures in with respect to well-being away from a merely physical or biological understanding of that into one that is more political, social, even spiritual. So I like that aspect about it as well. So here's my question: how can we frame promotion of that measure, planetary health, as the intrinsically political task that I think it is? Well, in welfare states, the promotion of human health has always been seen that way. So that's why the most progressive of these states have universally accessible national healthcare systems paid for by tax revenues. Any society that wants the health system to thrive as the multi-generational social fixture it is meant to be has a duty to cultivate the material and social conditions that allow for this. A strong tax base, measures that protect or enhance universal access, such as infrastructure in remote locations, Pigovian taxes on consumer products that create harmful externalities, and so on. The same is true of planetary health. It must be an explicit object of national policy with its own portfolio, ministry, etc. As the Canadian environmentalist and broadcaster David Suzuki has said, we need, in this country, a minister of the biosphere. But while we have a decent grasp of the general features of a good national healthcare system, we're still working out the general features of a good planetary health system. This is why it's important to highlight the concept of planetary boundaries in the definition of planetary health that I just read to you, right? I emphasize that idea of finite planetary boundaries. So the authors of this book on planetary health got the idea from the kind of groundbreaking work on planetary boundaries by Johan Rockström and his research team. This is now 10 years old and has been refined really amazingly well into a very elegant research project since then. So the planetary boundaries are quantifiable and mutually interacting parts of the Earth system that are essential to human flourishing. What the originators of that concept, Rockström and his and company, call a safe operating space for humanity can happen only inside those limits or boundaries. So here are the 9 boundaries. Certain biogeochemical flows, especially nitrogen and phosphorus, freshwater consumption, land use change, biosphere integrity, which measures both functional biodiversity and genetic biodiversity, climate change, novel entities, invasive species, and so on, stratospheric ozone depletion, atmospheric aerosol loading, and ocean acidification. So those are the 9 boundaries, and then they tell us, you know, how close we are to breaching the boundaries in the case of each of those particular limits. The concept of planetary boundaries has been constructed in an effort to move us away from a piecemeal approach to environmental protection. Instead, the approach focuses directly on biophysical processes, biogeophysical processes, especially the role of thresholds in triggering abrupt and potentially catastrophic changes at the level of the Earth system. In other words, in formulating national or subnational environmental policy, the idea is that we start at the global or biogeophysical level, right, the planetary level, by looking at these limits, and then work our way back to national and subnational levels or targets. Now that reverses the traditional way of making policy, which moves from, I would say, from the inside out. I should add here that there doesn't need to be a conflict between this approach and more ground-up decision-making. We've heard great reports here today from places like Atlanta, Minneapolis, Vancouver, and Boston. I like to articulate the concept of planetary boundaries in a way that links Earth system limits to on-the-ground struggles for environmental justice, like the kind we've been hearing about earlier today. Those struggles provide a way of actually localizing global concerns. In any case, the key point here is that with respect to many of these boundaries, biodiversity, biogeochemical flows, land use changes, and climate change, we are, according to the most recent reports of Rockström and his team, we're already in a dangerous or at least an uncertain zone. The worst ones, of course, are climate change and biodiversity. It follows, I think, that we need a novel way of understanding how we might seek to live within ecological limits. And among other things, that would involve rethinking the very distinction between humans and the non-human life world. I reject the idea that delineating the safe operating space for humanity is entirely or even mostly about finding technological solutions to our problems. Technology is very important, but I think the deeper issue is that we have failed to grasp the basic idea that explicit in the concept of planetary health, that human flourishing is inseparable from the flourishing of the non-human life world. And so we need to center that idea somehow. But how? The best way would be to attend to the promotion of biospherical flourishing at the same time as we address lingering issues of social justice. There are multiple ways of making that connection, and each of them is going to have to connect up to local struggles for economic and racial equality. So I live in Canada, just west of Toronto, and yeah, that second T is silent. So I want to talk about this with respect to the issue of the plight of the Indigenous peoples located within the boundaries of this particular nation state. Obviously, I cannot hope to do full justice to the complexities of this problem here or anywhere else. My point is just that because any sincere effort to address the social and political plight of Indigenous groups in this country is inseparably bound up with taking the promotion of biospherical integrity more seriously than we currently do, that this is an illuminating and hopeful example of the kind of work we need to do in the face of incipient climate chaos. So here's my final section. I'll begin just with a quick definition of traditional ecological knowledge. It's a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission about the relationship of living beings, including humans, with one another and with their environment. A number of recent developments at the level of the international community have made the rest of the world more aware of how important a renewed respect and understanding for Indigenous cultural practices is. For example, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted in 2007, contains 46 articles laying out a comprehensive statement on the rights of Indigenous peoples to control their traditional lands, their education system, to preserve their traditional cultural practices, and crucially, to transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, and philosophies. So for my purposes here, one of the most important of these traditions and philosophies is ecological knowledge and respect for nature. Again, those international bodies have recognized this contribution to human knowledge by the world's Indigenous peoples. A key pillar of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity is, quote, respecting, preserving, and maintaining traditional knowledge of the sustainable use of biological diversity with the involvement of Indigenous peoples and local communities, close quote. As is often pointed out in this context, although Indigenous groups comprise just 5% of the global population, they protect 80% of global biodiversity. How might we bring this knowledge to the non-Indigenous 95%? There's a potentially fruitful point of contact to exploit here, namely that the Western notion of the Anthropocene, recently developed, and traditional ecological knowledge both speak about the need to see nature as a source of agency. The potential concordance between Anthropocene science and traditional ecological knowledge on the theme of nature's agency helps us confront a persistent worry about talking in terms of the new age of humans, which is the literal translation, of course, of the Anthropocene, right? The new age of humans. The worry is that if the human imprint is everywhere, we'll no longer feel constrained to respect limits to the human enterprise, or that we'll be even less constrained than we currently are, and that this will give us permission to run roughshod over the non-human life world. I've been emphasizing that I think the discourse of limits is absolutely central to any sustainable pathway we develop going forward. But there's nothing in the discovery of the Anthropocene that compels us to adopt this stance. Indeed, because of the way it invites us to notice that our doings are affected by a vastly complex physical world over which we will never have full control, the advent of the Anthropocene effectively accords a kind of agency to that world. This epistemic insight should, I have argued elsewhere, be a source of humility, not hubris. Now, this is not to announce a grand consilience between Western science and traditional ecological knowledge. The insight I've pointed to is nothing but a starting point for discussion between the two worldviews. What I am reasonably confident about is that the synthesis can be forged only through broad cultural acceptance of the claim made by Unawigbi that we are not just talking about abstract epistemology, but are rather laying out a way towards proper living. That's how he describes traditional ecological knowledge, right? It's a way towards proper living. How then can we politicize this task? One way this is happening, in many ways, right? So I'm only going to suggest one here. One way this is happening is through the burgeoning rights of nature movement. In 2020, the Wangwini, I'm bound to mispronounce this, the Wangwini River, which runs through the North Island of New Zealand, was granted the status of legal person. The Maori, who believe their very identity is bound up with the fate of the river, had been advocating for this for some time. It's the translation of that identity claim. The Maori actually say, I am the river is me, into a rights claim that is key here. The same thing happened recently in Canada. The Mutasheka-Shipu River, which is in the Côte-Nord region of Quebec and is known in English as the Magpie River, was granted legal personhood by the municipality of Mijani and the Innu Council of, and I'm going to mispronounce this too, Equanishit in 2021. So the whole indigenous-based rights of nature movement is gaining significant ground internationally and is, in my view, the clearest sign of an emerging planetary consciousness and planetary regime with indigenous peoples as its vanguard. Of course, the powers that be will fight it so long as there's money to be made by exploiting resources unsustainably, but the juridical domain is as good a place as any to engage that particular enemy. In fact, making this all about the law is a powerful way of politicizing an epistemology that's also an ontology and an ethics. This legal maneuver is thus a crucial mechanism for decolonizing the process of encoding assets. For example, one of the rights recognized in the case of the Magpie River claim is the river's right to flow, an attribute that sets up a clear potential for legal conflict between that claim and a provincial government, the government of Quebec, that's always been bent on the expansion of hydropower through dam construction. This is the new battleground for the planet. Both by pushing for the proliferation of such rights and training an army of lawyers, not to mention judges, who are good at defending them, we should welcome the fights that it will enable. So I'll conclude very quickly now. By considering a possible objection to the model of planetary management I've proposed here. It might be supposed that the account is entirely too value-laden. But even if we reject a principle of well-being that's rooted in objective features of the social and environmental contexts of our lives, we won't be left with a value-neutral conception, but rather with whatever conception currently rules the roost. That is per capita GDP, a conception of well-being responsible for bringing the planet to the brink of full-blown climate catastrophe. I have stressed the importance of indigenous thinking, especially as reflected in traditional ecological knowledge and the rights of nature movement, because it strikes me as a genuinely novel alternative to this way of thinking and being. But the insight is also implicit in some of the measures of national well-being that have been constructed by civil society groups, NGOs, and the United Nations. Again, the Better Living Index strikes me as having just the right ratio of subjective and objective features, although, as I said, it could be improved by a more robust accounting of specifically climate-related factors. Though compared to most of these constructs, planetary health is in its infancy, and as such is relatively underdeveloped, it strikes me as the best framework we have for understanding the emerging planetary regime. So a synthesis between planetary health and traditional ecological knowledge, encompassing the natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, etc., could provide just the boost humanity needs to help it reconstruct our planetary home to make it more just and resilient in the age of climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Williston. You've given us much to think about. I really appreciate the depth of the philosophical analysis and in relation also to not only nature, but you know, combining what you said about the indigenous learning that the rest of us need to become aware of. And I have a question, if I may start out. And by the way, now is the time for our audience to please type in your question under the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen, please. And so the question is, are there examples? You gave New Zealand as an example of where we see some good direction in relation to what you're suggesting. Are there any examples in North America that you know of?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. So I also mentioned that context, that the Canadian example, right? So and the reason it excites me is what I said about one of the attributes of it that was being protected via the rights movement, the Innu, which is the group that has been pressing for this for a long time. So this is up in the sort of the far north of Quebec, near Labrador. The Innu were absolutely knowing, right, that the Quebec government wants that river to build a dam on. They insisted on the right of the river to flow. And I just think that's beautiful because now, I mean, and you know, the courts accepted it. The government came out and said, we don't accept it, but it, in a sense, doesn't matter what they say, because the battle, if it comes to the battle and the government wants to build a dam on that particular river, the courts will decide, right? The lawyers will hash it out. So that's happening there in Quebec. To be honest, I wish it were more widespread, and I think it's not happening nearly to the extent that we need. The most sort of forward or progressive jurisdiction, I think, in the world is Ecuador, because Ecuador has it in their constitution, has rights of nature built into their constitution. And so that, I think, is a real, I mean, that places them at the vanguard of this particular political and juridical movement. So I'm not aware of anywhere that this is gaining significant ground in the United States. I don't think it really is yet. And I think part of the reason for that may be that indigenous groups in the United States are not as well organized as they are in Canada and in certain places in South America, for example. So I wish it were more widespread. But I do think it's a real vanguard in the sense that Lenin defined that, right? It's a very small movement, but it's out in front in just the way that we need it to be out in front. And I do hope that more jurisdictions get behind it.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
I love the beginning when you spoke about the stages of life, you know, and you mentioned the adolescent features of adolescence. And I'm wondering, from a philosophical perspective or any perspective, what can we, especially in terms of education, and by we, I mean parents, I mean any of us what can we do to not only increase our own consciousness about our behaviors and our attitudes, and also how can we instill some of these values into children in particular?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, but a very large one. So I do, as the paper sort of made obvious, I do think of this whole project in educational terms. Part of my reason for doing that, just to give you some indication of the sort of philosophical pedigree behind this, is that I'm in many respects, when it comes to ethics, an Aristotelian. And Aristotle believed that you only become a virtuous person through a lifelong process of moral education, and that so in the company of people who are your moral betters, as it were, members of your collective, you sort of learn how to become a responsible member of the collective. I don't think it can be done. So there's something kind of hopeful about that general picture, right? That it's a developmental theory and it takes a whole lifetime. But on the other hand, it's also kind of depressing in a way, because we don't have that much time with respect to the climate crisis, right? I mean, we're talking about needing to cut in half emissions by 2030, and we're nowhere kind of near doing that, in spite of Radislav's he's more optimistic about all this than I am. I don't think we're anywhere near to actually accomplishing that. And so what can we do in light of that evident kind of failure to act, right? And the inertia that's set in. What we can do as individuals, I think, is, well, we can elect climate sincere politicians, and we can insist at a more local level that or work towards somehow building some of the insights that I've been talking about into the curriculum that we teach to students at all levels. This is actually one of the explicit aims of the people who have originated the idea of planetary health. What I like about that concept the most is precisely that it ties the health of the planet to the health of individuals as they develop in the context of collectives, right? So you can't divorce what we need to do in order to live sustainably from the things we teach our children on a daily basis. But obviously you're not going to be able to do, none of that happens in a vacuum, right? Or a social and political vacuum. I mean, if you live in a jurisdiction which is sort of politically backward in one way or another, you can't simply hope that the teachers your children have at school are gonna get all this. They probably aren't. And so that's some grounds, I think, for pessimism. But so long as people know, even in very broad terms, what are the things that we kind of need to do, I think you know where the leverage points are in society. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Dr. Seaman, do you have a question?
I do, and I think it actually builds on what you were just saying there, Professor Williston. The thing I was wondering is, how do we encourage people to take a more planetary approach to the problem of climate change? What we've seen from previous presentations is it's either been a sort of local approach or a national policy approach. How do we get to a more global planetary approach? And really kind of encourage people to think of it in that way.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, look, let's think about COVID, right? And like we're now in the stage of COVID where people are sort of talking in more or less explicit ways about lessons to be learned, right? Which is not to say we're out of the crisis by any means. In fact, what happens this fall could get even worse in many jurisdictions. But so what are some of the lessons, right? Well, I think that one of the lessons we ought to be taking from this is that health matters, and that our health and the health of our loved ones, including our elders and our children, is tied to things that go on outside of human collectives, right? I mean, this is a zoonotic disease that comes from, in some ways, from the natural world. So our health is tied to what goes on in the biosphere. Now, lots of studies are starting to emerge suggesting that that we're in for more COVIDs the more we push into, more or less recklessly, into the habitats of other plants and animals, and thereby kind of come crashing into these potential epidemics, right? So we have to learn to at least start to think about our own health. So there's that, right? Like I would say, think about our own health in relation to what goes on in the biosphere, and then just try and get the point that what goes on in the biosphere is going to be deeply, deeply affected by things like climate change, right? So we actually have to take care of that at the same time. These are not separate issues. So there's that, right? And then the second very broad issue that I think we're starting to learn about from COVID is that we need to think about well-being in kind of the broad way I've been suggesting. It isn't just about sort of narrowly biological health, as important as that is, right? I mean, that's kind of a foundation, we might like to say. But I think that one of the things that this particular crisis has made us all aware of are issues of mental health that are tied to the kinds of ways we have of interacting with other people. And when those are radically upset, or disrupted, that affects people's sense of well-being in a more abstract sense than just their physical well-being. So I think we need to think about, so it gets us to think about that. And then a third thing I would suggest that we've learned from COVID that is also relevant to tackling the climate crisis, because it's right there in the Green New Deal, is how we think about work. You know, like we've all been talking about essential workers, right? Well, what is essential work? I don't think that concept has been subjected to nearly the amount of critical analysis that it needs to be subjected to. But what we ought to see from this particular crisis is that some of the things that we haven't thought before as essential work really are, and maybe lots of the things that we thought of as being essentially as being more valuable, perhaps because they are more tied to increases in GDP numbers or something like that, or maybe not so important, right? So those are the three elements that I think we need to work on for the climate crisis, but that we have a way into via the COVID crisis.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions that anyone would like to pose? I think you've given us a very good challenge.
Just what we need.
Yeah, right. But no, it is what we need, actually. I think when things get rough, we need to become a little bit more disciplined, as you said. Anyway, thank you so much, Professor Williston. I really appreciate your thoughtful lecture, and we hope that we will see some positive changes in the directions that you have addressed today. And so with that, let me see, there is a queue. It looks like there, someone has just said, thank you for sharing your wonderful insights, a comment from the audience. So with that, we will now take a break until 4:30, at which time we will hear from Professor Carletta Chief, and her talk is about climate change impacts on water resources of Native Americans in the US. So please come back and join us at 4:30. Thank you.